Good evening, Yarimadat, and welcome to the Ismaili Centre. Welcome to ITREB UK Conversations with the Author series, which is being hosted tonight by Reading Jamaat Khana Reading Club. So thank you, Reading, for hosting us this evening, at least at the Ismaili Centre. And I hope that you can all see the beautiful garden that we're sitting in front of. And we are also joined by some exotic birds who are going to be making some noises, I'm sure, during the course of the evening. Now, I'm really excited to be here. One, because this is signaling a bit of a start for us to be back in person, although we miss having a live audience, but we are doing this for the very first time. But I'm also more excited to be here with you, Shainool.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us this evening. I've been a big fan of your work for many, many years, and I'm really excited about this book. And for those of you that have read the book or haven't, I was a little cheeky earlier on when I asked Shainool to sign the book for me, and she said, "I'll see how you do this evening." So just know I haven't got a signed copy just yet. But let's start, Shainool, talking about the book. And what was the inspiration behind this book?
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, ITREB UK, for hosting us and for being at the Ismaili Centre. It's just such a delight to be back in this building. So thank you for that opportunity. Talking about what's inspired me to write the book takes me back to the founding of the Institute of Ismaili Studies, because when Maulana Hazar Imam first founded it in 1977, many of us will remember he sent a talika worldwide, a message worldwide, to say that not since the Fatimid period has there been a center of research on Ismaili studies. And since that time, for 44 years now, the Institute has done a tremendous amount of research, as we know, on all sorts of subjects: Ismaili studies, Shi'i studies, Quranic studies, and the list carries on. There's been also a lot of research on the Fatimids. We have several titles that you can see on the screen in front of you, including providing material for our primary talim children as well as for the secondary students. So this particular series, which aims to draw from the scholarship of the Institute, but then make it available in an accessible, engaging, interesting format to a non-specialist readership, both in the Jamaat as well as in the world at large. And the aim is therefore to make knowledge accessible, engaging, purposive, and to do it in a way that draws upon the best scholarship we can provide. So while this little book is quite little and thin purposefully, because we want to make it pocket-sized, it draws, it builds on from all this robust scholarship that has happened at the Institute, but also in the world of Islamic studies more broadly.
And what I found really interesting is, although it's a pocket-sized book, as you call it, and very accessible, and I had the first read-through in a couple of hours, we could probably spend a book club's worth of 90 minutes per chapter, per event, that we are going to struggle in the next 90-odd minutes to try and get through as much as we can. But I think what I'd like to try and draw upon with you are some of the big themes, subtle themes that are coming through. And as a historian, you must have struggled to decide what goes in there. But let's start, because the Jamaat and at large the community, when we talk about the Fatimids, we often think of a period in history where things were very pluralistic. The Imam reminds us to draw on this history. Could you talk to us about the pluralistic heritage or the nature of that time?
Yes, I mean, that's a very interesting point, isn't it? How do we look at our heritage? And what do we look at as we think about our 1400-year heritage? And one of the things that Maulana Hazar Imam often reminds us about is the values, the outlook, the attitudes that we have inherited through our history. And to my mind, this particular quote of Maulana Hazar Imam at the opening of the Azhar Park, where he reminds us of two such attitudes. He talks about the pluralistic history and the intellectual profile of this particular period. And when we talk about these two qualities, it isn't something that is only specific to the Fatimids. The Muslim world at large in the first 4 centuries had these attitudes to knowledge, to learn from various sources, various traditions, etc. And in that sense, the Fatimids epitomize that as well. They also are part of that conversation that is going on in the world at the time. And so for our conversation today, and in terms of what we might pick up, I'm hoping that these two, pluralistic heritage and the role of intellect, might be 2 themes, along with celebrations, because that's another major feature of our tradition as well.
And I think what we'd like to do is to draw upon, I mean, there are just gems across this book, and let's try and draw on some of those. Okay. But let's be clear about the period in history, the years, and the imams that covered this period, and what your book is trying to do with this. So if you could just talk to that for a moment.
Sure. So this is the period from the time of our 11th Imam, Maulana Abdullah al-Mahdi, and it goes all the way to the time of Imam Mustansir Billah. So we are talking about the period from 909 CE all the way to 1094 CE. So that's the 2.5 century period that we're referring to, the 9th to the 11th, 12th centuries.
Yes, and I think those of you on Zoom will be able to see a slide which takes us from the 11th to the 18th Imam, and that's the focus of that Fatimid time. And if we move on and look at the landscape, the geography, and the time, I think you've got a great slide for us that you've prepared, which talks us through the Imams, and the focus of this book is on the early part.
Yes, it is. Absolutely, Rahim, it is. And it is looking at the Fatimids in North Africa, which is a 64-year period from 909 till the Imam moves out of, when I say North Africa, what I really mean is Ifriqiya, as it is called at the time, which is Tunisia and parts of eastern Algeria, which is where they were based originally. Then, of course, they move along the coast, a Mediterranean coast, and they settle in Egypt, and that's where the Fatimids then rule for another 200 years. But for the purposes of this book and our discussion today, we are looking at this North African period of our history, where we have the first 4 Fatimid Imam Caliphs, Imam al-Mahdi, Imam al-Qayyum, Imam al-Mansur, and Imam al-Mu'izz. And it is in the reign of Imam al-Mu'izz, the 4th Fatimid Imam Caliph, that Egypt is then brought under Fatimid rule, and the Imam makes that transition from Ifriqiya, from Mahdiya and Mansuriya to what then comes to be called Al-Qahira Al-Mu'izziya, the victorious city of Imam al-Mu'izz.
Right, which is now known as Cairo.
It is, but even today, when you look at, so if you look at if you go to the main thoroughfare in Cairo, not far from where the Azhar Park is, the main street downtown, it is still called Shari al-Mu'izz li-Din Allah, the street of Imam al-Mu'izz li-Din Allah. And the full name of Cairo is Al-Qahira Al-Mu'izziya, the victorious city of al-Mu'izz, although most people will not now call it that full name.
Right, right. But good to know that and reference that. I wanted you to paint us a picture of the journey from 905. And I know that you've also been very kind to produce a map. And what would be great is to do a couple of things if you can. So it's a kind of a double question. One is the journey of 905 onwards. But then when we look at this map on the screen, what was the geopolitics of the time? When the Fatimid Empire was in its full swing, covering that period as we see, and how were the Ismaili Imams seen at the time?
Great, lots of things to talk about. So it's interesting because when we look at the map, and by the way, many of these images, these maps, these charts are in the book, but they are also on the IIS website. Wonderful. So for those of you who are interested after the event to look up, you will find these resources on the IIS website under the World of Islam page as well. So this map is certainly there, and it's very interesting. When we look at this map, we see Salamia on it, which we will talk about in a little while. From Salamia, you have Imam al-Mahdi traveling all the way from Palestine into Egypt, and then arriving in, as I said, Ifriqiya. And in the Imam's arrival into this region and in the establishment of the Fatimids in this region at this period, it is a very significant moment, not just for Ismaili history, but actually much more broadly for the Mediterranean region. So the Mediterranean region by this point was becoming a major hub of international trade across Europe, all the way from Spain and Portugal, which is where we had another Muslim empire called the Umayyads, who were based there. This is the Umayyads of Andalusia, not to be confused with the Umayyads of Damascus, of course, who had reigned earlier. So in this period, you have three empires already established, and then the Fatimids are the fourth. Right? So you had the Umayyads of Andalusia, and Andalusia, of course, meaning present-day Spain and Portugal. You then had what was called as the Byzantine Empire, which was Christian, Eastern Christian, with its capital at Constantinople, present-day Istanbul. And you then have the Abbasids ruling over the eastern regions with their capital in Baghdad. So with the arrival of the Fatimids, what they do is very quickly they establish a powerful navy. And through that navy, they then are not only able to protect their expanding empire, but they are also able to facilitate and foster trade right across the Mediterranean. So it also makes them economically very affluent, but also they become part of this engagement of the exchange of people, goods, ideas, cultures, cuisines. So it's a very vibrant period in which the Fatimids arrive in this region and very quickly become part of that success story, if you like, of that region.
Yes, and just to spend another moment on the map, because it's such a powerful map, and you identified that they're surrounded by other empires, caliphates, kingdoms that are emerging.
Yes.
But if you look particularly at the Fatimid Caliphate, on the coast, the sea, was there much use made of the fact that it was by the sea and how it was trying to trade? And also, could you talk to Sicily, because it's dark, and what was happening there? You got Portugal and Spain in.
Yeah.
For those of us in Europe,
Yes.
we're quite keen on this.
Very much so, and the book, as you know, has a whole section on Sicily. So today, to your point earlier about geopolitics and geography, and how much geopolitics also impact how we understand geography today. Yeah. So today we see Sicily as part of Europe, of course, and we see Tunisia as part of North Africa. When the Fatimids arrive in the region, and with their spread, Sicily was as much part of their empire. It was the next stop from Mahdia on the boat,
Right.
literally. Right. So Sicily was at the heart of the Fatimid venture in the Mediterranean. And so it's very interesting that when we also think about that, we also realize that North Africa was ethnically and religiously diverse at this time as well. So you had, you had Berbers, who were the indigenous people, you had Arabs who had settled there. Religiously, you had Christians, you had Jews, you had Muslims from different Sunni denominations, and Shia. So in that sense, it was also a very vibrant, very lively, very, versatile, if you like, community of peoples that were living in that time.
And I did ask you, how were the imams seen? There were caliphs as well as the Ismaili imams. Were they perceived in a particular way around that time, just generally?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because as we will also come to, look at a bit later, this idea of the Fatimids arriving in this region, taking on the name Fatimids. Right? I mean, it's again one of the very unique characteristics of the Fatimids that they name themselves through a woman, through the daughter of the Prophet, Fatima, because for them, they see themselves as the direct inheritors of the legacy of the Prophet, through Fatima and Ali, whose progeny they are from. So this idea of them being Shia, and now establishing an empire, because previously the Abbasids had, of course, were Sunni, although Sunni Islam was just beginning to take shape and crystallize at the time. It's very interesting that the Fatimids are the only Shia empire who are, who actually are extremely successful in this, in holding sway across this vast swathe of lands, all the way from the shores of the Atlantic, right across the Mediterranean, and then into the Red Sea, and of course then spreading their influence into the Indian Ocean as well.
It almost in the map looks like a bridge.
Yes.
They're bridging kind of this east and west, and
That's
they're
right.
even to the north.
Yeah.
Which, thank you for sharing that with us today. Now, for me, growing up in the West, as an Ismaili Muslim, always spoken with fascination about Syria, about Salamiyya, the importance of this country, the importance of the city, and historically, in a much later period, it played a very significant role. But it played a very important role pre-Fatimids. And when we think about this period, we don't always associate it with it. And your book talks about that. Do you want to shed some light on that?
Sure. So, we all, most of us will have heard about the Fatimids, and, we take great pride, of course, because the Imams were front and center. They were, they were extremely powerful. For 100 years, we had the Imams being recognized as the rightful authority over the entire Muslim world in the khutbahs in Mecca and Medina. Wow. They were pronounced, as the right over the Abbasid caliphs. They were. So they had that kind of impact and influence. Okay, but when you think about all that, what leads to that success is another really interesting and I think little told story of the Dora Satar. And when we talk about the Dora Satar, this so-called period of concealment, Satar literally means a curtain, so behind a curtain, right? When we talk about this period, we are really talking about the time from when Imam Jafar as-Sadiq passes away. And because of the severe persecution of the Abbasids at the time, the Imams, both of not just the Imams who claim to be descendants of Ali and Fatima, are now in a very dangerous situation, because the Abbasids make claims for themselves along the same lines as, in fact, they are not quite the descendants of the Prophet, but they claim to be successors of Abbas, who is an uncle of the Prophet. Right. So they're making very similar claims to the claims that the Shia were making about their Imams.
They're challenging the
ideology. Absolutely. Yeah. And so you find that after Imam Jafar as-Sadiq passes away, the Shia go through a major cataclysm, if you like, a major crisis, in that the succession after Imam Jafar as-Sadiq comes to be bifurcated, at least between two, originally between several, but eventually crystallizes around two. Those who come to follow Imam Jafar as-Sadiq's eldest son, Imam Ismail, come to be called Ismailis, which is us. Yes. But then there were those who followed his younger son called Musa, who initially are called Musawis and eventually called Ithna Asharis, because their 12th Imam goes into Gaiba. Right? Yeah. So this is the period when all of that is happening. And so the identity of the Imam, the whereabouts of the Imam, the names of the Imam, all of these are now camouflaged, because it is a highly dangerous time politically as well for them. And so we find that what could have been what you said, right, the dark period, or so to speak, where we, in fact, and where we think that, everything kind of goes behind the curtain, so to speak.
Almost underground.
Almost underground. In fact, it goes underground. Yeah. It proves to be, when you look back retrospectively, in fact, an extremely important and dynamic time. It is the time where, over a period of decades, the Imams finally come to settle in Salamiyya. They are living there as Hashimi merchants. People don't know that they are actually, that they are imams, because that claim is still not made public. But we now know that the locus of imamat, so Salamia becomes the locus of imamat. Very few trusted dais of the imam, the emissaries, what we might call missionaries, or waizins, or whatever we want to call them. But these dais are the ones who are now in touch with the imam. They come and go, they visit the imam, they receive guidance from him, they bring tributes from different places to him. And it's fascinating that in this period the dawah actually spreads across several regions. We have dawah in Iraq, in Iran, in Yemen, in what comes to be called Sindh wa Hind. It also spreads into North Africa. So the dawah becomes extremely agile and active. And it is the dais who are the glue for the community. They continue to provide the teachings of the imams to the faithful. They are the ones who not only call for the imam, but also to establish a political state, an entity for the imam. And it's very interesting when you look at what they call this. So they call themselves the Dawatul Hadiyah. The rightly guided dawah, or the dawatul haq, who's looking to establish truth, right? And similarly, the state that they are espousing for is also saying that it will be the dawlatul haq, the dawlatul hadiyah. So it's very interesting that these values that they are espousing to is very much inherent in this whole cause, in this whole mission, as it were. And so Salamia is the imamat's hub, where
during this period.
Right. But as we were discussing earlier, the actual training of the dais happens in Yemen, where you have one of the senior dais called Ibn Hawshab, who is based there. And the imam, we have writings, we have sources that actually give us these descriptions of how the imam, it's at the hand of the imam that Ibn Hawshab gives the allegiance to the imam. The imam then personally sends him to Yemen with this mission. He then sends these other dais to be trained there. All of this is now known to us.
Right.
And I think, to my mind, when we think about tumultuous times, challenging times, times where we think things are going awry, right? We have in our history, we have in our heritage, these examples of how the imams have used these periods to provide guidance and direction which has longevity, which builds resilience, which builds capacity, so that when we make a comeback, we are actually better and stronger in that sense, right?
So there's a couple of interesting things that come from what you just said, because one, I take from that period of concealment becomes a very important time to develop and spread the message. So talking about spreading that message, and you talked about centers, where did Yemen come into this? And how did Yemen play that role?
Right. So Yemen is one of the earliest centers where the Ismaili Dawah got established. Okay, as was also the Caspian region, which we then come to get familiar with after the Fatimids during our Alamut period. Right. So these two were already centers where there was a lot of Shia sentiments, a lot of positivity towards the Shia. So it's not a surprise that the Ismaili Dawah finds a hub there, right? But with this, as I said, from Yemen, these dais were then sent to different parts of the world. And that's where, you find that dais were sent to what is called, as I said, Sindh as well. Sindh as in the Indian subcontinent.
So what's now Pakistan?
Yeah, in what's Pakistan in India,
province.
Region. Yeah. So dais were even, we know of, in fact, a nephew of Ibn Hawshab, whom he sends to Sindh as a dai. So this dawah becomes very far-flung and spread. And to make another interesting point about this fusion between din and dunya, these dais often functioned as merchants. Right. So they traveled along these trade routes. They met with others, and they could communicate and they could trade as a way of living, but they could also use this as a way of spreading the message of the cause of the imamate.
And traveling for training we just take a flight or a bus or a train. I mean, this would have taken months or years.
Years sometimes, absolutely. This was, so in the...
I mean, Yemen's not near.
It's not near. Think about where Syria is and where Yemen is, and then think where Tunisia is.
Right.
I mean, you're not talking neighbor countries at all.
No.
And when these da'is undertook these journeys, they often undertook journeys that were life-changing for them. Right? Like we will see with Abu Abdullah Shi.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to come to, because in your book you mention Abu Abdullah, one of the da'is, and his incredible journey. And I think that's worthy of a mention for those who haven't read the book yet.
Sure. So he is a native of Kufa of Iraq. That's where he is born and brought up and spends his early years. He then joins the Dawah. He is then sent to Yemen. And from Yemen, he then goes to Mecca for a pilgrimage. That's where he meets these Kutama Berbers who've come all the way from Tunisia. They invite him to join them because they see in him somebody who is very pious, who is very knowledgeable. So they say to him, come and join us, come and live with us and teach our children on how to be good, good human beings, good Muslims, etc. So the da'i doesn't immediately talk about the Ismaili, beliefs to them. That is something that is slowly introduced, and people are then accept, etc. And so this quote that I have put in front of us gives that story about how in 893 Abu Abdullah arrives in the land of the Kutama, and he as soon as he arrives, he starts with these what come to be called majalis al-hikmah, right? Majlis, we still use the word majlis in our tradition.
Yes.
Literally, it just means a gathering. Hikmah, knowledge, wisdom.
Yeah.
And in this case, it is the wisdom of the teachings of the imams. So Abu Abdullah, she starts these sessions of wisdom, this Majalis al-Hikmah, as soon as he arrives in North Africa, and it becomes a hallmark of the Ismaili Dawah, not just in North Africa, but in all these other regions. And it is, these Majalis al-Hikmah are offered also for men, but also for women. They are also offered for people of different trades and professions. So it's very interesting. Again, we have a lot of texture around this, right?
And the first example
Yes.
in your book of this idea of search for knowledge,
Yes.
the role of the intellect,
Yes.
and exercising the intellect
Yes.
through this Majlis al-Hikmah. This idea, we come together and we study and we listen and we learn. And I think that's a very, very powerful example. I want to move to what I thought was a very powerful beginning of paragraph 2. And for those of you that are watching online, you'll see the proclamation of the Fatimid Caliphate in Karyawan, Friday, 5th January 1910. It's quite specific and we have evidence, and I'll read this to those of you who are watching also, and then maybe you can speak to it, Shainool. Quotes, God, may his praise be exalted and his name sanctified, fulfilled his promise to his messenger, may God bless him and his family, by restoring the legacy of the Prophet and the keys of the Imamate to the family of his Prophet. He honored religion and the believers, saving them from disaster in every situation with the advent of the servant of God, Abu Muhammad al-Imam al-Mahdi Billah, commander of the believers. May your adherence to the rope of obedience to him and the bond of loyalty to him become strong. For indeed no bond connects God and his servants except through their love for the family of the Prophet. May God bless him and grant him salvation. God exalted be his mention has said, quotes, say, no reward do I ask of you except for the love of those near of kin, unquote. And the Quran, Holy Quran 26:23. This proclamation is a very, very public statement. And I think it would be great if you could talk to, how did this even happen? There had to be conditions ready to come out of a period of concealment to come to a very, very public proclamation, and not just to the Ismailis who were there. Right?
Yes, absolutely. This was to the world at the time. And it is very, if I can even say audacious,
Yes.
right? It is really quite incredible, very momentous. Because up until that time, there was only one Muslim caliphate, and that was the Abbasids.
Yes.
So remember I mentioned about the Umayyads of Andalusia, of Spain and Portugal? While they were an empire, they called themselves an emirate. They didn't take on the title of the caliphate because there was this notion that there is only one caliph. When the Fatimid Imam Caliph is declared, he is declared first of all as a descendant of the Prophet.
Yes.
And it's interesting that the Fatimids, when they spoke about the Prophet, and they often did, called him Jadduna, our grandfather, because they referred to him in that way. And the whole model of governance that they set up was actually fashioned on the model of governance that the Prophet had established in Medina as a head of state.
Right.
That's their model, okay? So for them, when they are presenting themselves, that's how they present themselves, that they are the true inheritors of the spiritual and temporal authority of the Prophet, and therefore the true caliphs over the Muslim world. So they're not just proclaiming their imamat to in the Shia sense of allegiance that the believers had given, the faithful had given. At the same time, in the same breath, they are also caliphs. They're proclaiming themselves as, which is why in sources they're often called imam caliphs.
Yes.
Or caliph imams, because both these are
They absorb
roles.
the dual role.
Absolutely, because they see themselves as rightful inheritors
And
of
the
the
fact
prophets.
that they make a statement like that
Yes.
is a recognition that they accept that there are those that are not, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But we are still here to guide both.
Not absolutely, and it's a fascinating point you raise, Rahim, because in the way they develop not only their model of governance, but in the way they develop their theology, they allow for this understanding. So there are what are called the mu'minun, the mu'mins, who are the believers, i.e. those who have given allegiance to the imam as the imam, but they are also the muslimun. Right, who are Muslims, who have given allegiance to, pronounce the Shahada and are part of the broader Muslim community. And then there are those who are, people of the book, the Jews and the Christians, etc. So the way they see themselves as just as the Prophet in Medina established this commonwealth, where we know that in the Prophet's time, in Medina, there were Jews, there were Christians, there were those who were called idolaters, there were those who were Muslims, there were all of these. And the Prophet was the ruler over all of them as the head of the state of Medina. That's how they see themselves in that role. And they use a powerful Quranic term called dhimma, which means protection. And so they see themselves as protectors. In the South Asian tradition, we have this word chhatra chaya.
Like an umbrella.
Exactly. This parasol, this umbrella, this protective, canopy.
Yes.
And they see themselves as providing that for all their flock, whoever they may be in terms of their religious and ethnic backgrounds.
And I find that other word very strong, the keys of the imamate. We talk about the rope of imamate,
Yes.
the link,
Yes.
that the key will be passed down, that the rope is to be extended. It's a very powerful statement to make in that light.
It is, and it's very Quranic, and you often find they use hablillah, this idea of the rope of God as well, as they are and they see themselves in that way, and they position themselves in that way.
Yeah.
Very much so.
So that's the start of only chapter 2, and there's so much more that we want to cover.
Get moving, yes.
Now, one of the things that you do is you look at the festivals, and for those of us watching, May, June, July have been festival time, from the end of Ramadan, the Eid al-Fitr, and we've got Eid al-Adha on Monday, Tuesday. We've also had Imamah Day the other day. So this idea of festivals, and I'd like you to speak about the festivals, but particularly there's mention of the one in Alexandria, in 915, and maybe we can start there because there's others I want to touch on as well.
Okay. Okay, great. So I guess the question that I think you're about to ask is 915 in Alexandria. What's going on?
We're on 905. We're in the other part of North Africa.
That's right. That's right.
Ifriqa onwards,
yes.
and suddenly we're in Egypt at the same time.
Yeah, what's going on? Exactly. So it's very interesting. The Fatimids, while they go all the way from Salamia, all the way, and they arrive, it takes the Imam 7 years, Imam al-Mahdi, to make that journey from Salamia to Sijil Masa, because it is a highly dangerous journey as well. He has to, he stops at several places, including in Egypt, etc. But it's very interesting that after they arrive in Ifriqiya and establish the city of Al-Mahdiya, which hopefully we will get to touch on as well, their interest in Egypt is there from very early on, okay? And Egypt had been one of the major hubs of the Fatimid Dawah. We know that, of the Ismaili Dawah, we know that as a given. So you find that soon after Imam Mahdi establishes himself in North Africa, he sends an army under his son, but also his successor, his heir, right, his Wali Ahad, Imam al-Qaim, who then, as I said, later becomes, and he is sent to Egypt to see if they could now establish their sway in Egypt. And during this period, you have this Eid occurring. And so you have Imam al-Qaim giving a khutbah for the Eid, giving a sermon for Eid. And it's very interesting when you look at the language in there, he uses this metaphor of the Imams being shepherds. So back to that idea of protection, of care, of compassionate care, right? And so this idea that the Imams are like shepherds, and they take care of their flock, right? Whoever, black sheep, white sheep, brown sheep, part of the flock, right? And so you find this language that is also very interesting in this khutbahs. The Imams were also known to be extremely powerful orators, and so we actually have a collection. One of the volumes we have at the Institute is a collection of these orations of the Fatimid Imams, which have been preserved in different sources.
Wow. So to spend a few hours looking through those, right?
Yes.
But I do like that metaphor of shepherding, because it means more than just I'm providing you with a bit of shelter, I'm going to guide you.
Exactly.
I'm going to show you which is the better place to go.
Yeah.
Because I have that,
Yeah. And because I have been chosen to do this.
Right.
I have been designated to do this.
In that khutbah, there's the responsibility of what the Imam has to do or they have to do, and what the flock in return expects.
Exactly. So it's a two-way. Yeah. You see, it's not just one way.
Yeah.
It's very powerful.
It brings a new light to the idea of
what we today might talk about Imam-Murid relationship as well.
But the bayah isn't one way.
No.
It's a two-way.
Of course.
Yeah. And then staying with Eid, we then want to go to 947.
Okay.
And we're in Kiana. And give us another example there, because another guidance khutbah has taken place, and talk to us on that.
So fascinating time, right? From 915 to 947. So we are not talking chronologically very, but those are very, very momentous years for the Fatimids. This is the time, during this period, in Imam Qaim's time, you have a major revolt that happens, because, it's not all hunky-dory. There is obviously new rulers, they are very energetic, they are powerful, they are asserting their authority, they are appointing their own governors over these various places, and there is a backlash. And there is this Khariji figure, Abu Yazid, who galvanizes various opposition forces, marches against the Fatimids. At one point, the Fatimid army is reduced to the gates of Mahdiya. Right? They've really lost control over most of their territory. And it is in this critical time that Imam Qaim passes away. Right. So even the announcement of Imam Mansur as the successor is not made. It's kept quiet. It's only kept given to the trusted coterie of people around the Imam. But Imam al-Mansur actually takes the baton himself, marches himself, leads the Fatimid army that galvanizes the Fatimid forces, re-energizes them, and eventually they are able to defeat the forces of Abu Yazid. But this khutbah is while they are on the march, which is why it is in Algeria. It's in Kiana in Algeria.
So
right?
just moving on.
That's right. So they are actually on the march with the Imam, the Fatimid forces. They are still pursuing Abu Yazid. He's been now evicted out of Mahdia, but he's not been defeated in the sense that they've not captured him. They've not finally put an end to his revolt yet. And so it is during that time, so on the march, that this khutbah is issued, is given. And Imam Mansur in particular was known extremely well for his oratory. It could bring people to tears, etc. And he gives this long khutbah. But in this khutbah, in this sermon, there is this powerful messaging around, even though they are going through this very turbulent time, he is talking about make your souls answerable. This idea of din and dunya. Remembering that there is a hereafter and that you also have to work for your soul.
And it's so interesting because I know that at this point would have been very difficult. A loss of an imam,
yes.
A new imam, hasn't been what we would expect as being some kind of ceremony and the community coming together. They're at war, if I can call it that, looking to defeat Abu Yazid, and to still come so philosophically out. It's again a wonderful passage which you pull out for us. Really well. And I just want to remind those of you that are watching at home that we will make times for questions, and if they would like to ask questions, unfortunately we can't do it live because there's a slight 10-second delay from when we're speaking to you listening. But if you'd like to put those questions into the chat, then we will make sure that they'll appear on my screen at some point. There's a team looking after that here, and Shainool, I'll make sure we try and answer as many questions as we can. I'd like to look at what happened after the defeat of Abu Yazid, and how would we describe the model of governance? Because now the threat has been extinguished. Mm-hmm. There's time to grow. There's time to do things. What lessons can we learn from that kind of governance?
It's a really interesting question, because you see, one of the things that historians say, and most of what we know about the Fatimids often comes to us through Abbasid historiography, because it's who writes history, the vanquished don't generally, all of that stuff, right? So most of our sources that we have about this period also relies heavily on Abbasid historiography. But even when you look at that record, you generally find that most historians have given the judgment that this was a tolerant period, it was a peaceful period, etc. But it's very interesting how they arrived at that. It wasn't a given. So let me walk you through an example, okay? When Imam Mahdi first arrives, as was the norm in the world at the time, he of course appoints an Ismaili governor over each of the cities, right? Because now it's the Fatimids that are ruling, right? When Imam Mansur secures this victory over Abu Yazid, one of the major hotbeds of dissent had been Kairouan, because that's where the Maliki ulama, the Maliki religious leadership had a very strong hold, and they were being supported by the Umayyads of Andalusia, who were also Maliki. Okay, so in this moment of victory, one would think that now they have the wherewithal to appoint their own governor, an Ismaili governor, of course, because the victory had been had. Imam Mansur does something very interesting. He consults these scholarly classes in Kairouan with the Malikis, and together they arrive at the selection of a governor who is a Maliki. He is a Sunni scholar who is now appointed as a Fatimid governor over Kairouan. And Madelung, Wilfred Madelung, who's one of these very famous, as well-known scholars of Islam generally, but particularly of Shia Islam, calls this a momentous shift in Islamic governance, not just because it's the first time where you have a legal appointment being made of a governor of a different madhab, of a different tradition, not even of a sister Shia tradition, from a Sunni tradition, right?
And then the individual accepted.
He accepted and he
The
rules
appointment.
as a Fatimid governor. And so that's where the seeds of this, what we come to call the inclusive governance of the Fatimids in Egypt, get sown to my mind. And in this khutbah that we then have from Imam Mansur's time,
Yes.
it's very interesting that he is also showing another facet of governance in terms of compassion and care. So because of these ravages of warfare that people had suffered, they weren't able to necessarily give the taxation that was due, etc. So it gets announced just after the victory from Abu Yazid that in fact the taxation that was due to the state is actually relinquished, and they are given a year's respite.
Right.
And it wasn't just to the Ismailis or even to the Muslims. It is to all the people who were living there, and they are also mentioned as the Jews and the Christians, etc. So you can see these various shifts that are happening that together make up for eventually a package of inclusive governance.
And it strikes me that there's a conscious way of doing it.
Yeah.
It's not just a byproduct of a decision, but consciously wanting to reach out, including everybody, giving them roles, and for those individuals to accept that that appointment can be made and willing to serve with loyalty. That's the bit that fascinates me.
Yes, and what is going to be part 2 of the book, where we will talk about Fatimids in Egypt, inshallah, by next year, you find that the Fatimids benefit hugely from a much broader talent pool, therefore.
Right.
Because they're not just relying on Ismailis.
Yes.
Whoever has those competencies can then rise to these head of, senior leadership roles within the Fatimid state.
Early signs of meritocracy.
There you go.
Now, one of the things that strikes me, learning of what I know about the Fatimid Empire and from your book, is imams being seen as city builders, building environments, cities being named after them, the founders of cities. What can we learn from that, and what does that tell us about how they looked at the environment of the time? If you could speak to that.
Sure. It's very interesting because, again, we are very fortunate that we have some first-hand accounts by the imams themselves. Right. So this particular one that I've put on the slide for us to look at, and it's in the book as well, is Imam Moez recollecting as a child, accompanying his father, as Imam Mansur, who was fascinated not just with previous Muslim civilizations, but even prior to that, right? So he goes and he tours Carthage, this extremely well-known, even now a UNESCO site, of course, heritage site,
yes.
right? Which was a powerful city of its time and a capital of its time. And so he tours that, and he speaks to his young son to say, I wonder, who built these cities and how did they arrive at choosing the location where they built, and how did they agree? And one king can't build such a vast, metropolis. And how did different kings agree one after the other to continue building in the same site? Because kings rarely agree with each other. So, there's a lot of thought being given. And we also know, again, from our sources, that in choosing to build the city of Al-Mahdiya, that Imam Mehdi also had spent that kind of attention and care, and had finally arrived at building Mahdiya at a place which is a deep harbor. And so as soon as they build that city, shipbuilding is one of the first things they do. And like we already talked about, this idea of
the location,
location, ensuring that all the environmental aspects from their point of view, their vantage point, are also being considered. So this idea, and it's interesting you call them city builders, because of the first 4 Fatimid Imam caliphs, they built 3 new cities between them. We have Al-Mahdiya, which still exists to this day. Al-Mansuriya is built on the very spot where Abu Yazid is defeated, but it's also built as a city of rapprochement between the Sunnis and the Ismailis, the Malikis and the Ismailis. It's built very close to Kairouan, which then gets destroyed because of earthquakes in the region. So we only have some remnants of the city. And then, of course, Imam Muez lays the foundation, Cairo, right, which is the next story.
And so, because on your slide, for those of you that are looking at the slide, you'll see that you've highlighted Al-Mansur's period of 946, 953. And I think sometimes we underrate what this Imam did. And maybe you could speak to that, because I almost see him as a pivot, taking us into the next phase of development of the empire.
Very much so. You know, there's a lot of limelight and glory rightly given to Imam Muez, because it is in Imam Muez's time that the Fatimids really become befitting of being called an empire, right? Because they start off as any other provincial dynasty, if you like, you know, in a localized dynasty. But by the time they arrive in Egypt, then they really are a major. But the foundations of that, like we talked about already, in terms of governance, in terms of inclusivity, in terms of compassion, and there are several examples. But Imam Mansur actually only reigned for 7 years.
Right.
But he laid those foundations on which then Imam Muez had the opportunity to build.
So a lot achieved in a
Yes.
7-year period. I want to move to 969, to when Egypt, we're in Egypt now. And because this is the period we all recognize as being the Fatimid period a lot, but we know there's much more from this book, so highly recommend it. But there's so many little things that I wanted to speak to you about this. First of all, governance, the diversity of the beliefs that were in that city, in that country. It was a very diverse. It's the opposite end of North Africa. So first, share the views of what was happening when the Imam arrived, or before the Imam arrived. He'd sent Johor to set it up. But also, we associate that part of the world with Al-Azhar. And I know many people call it the first university in the world, but it was a center of learning. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention it now.
Of course, absolutely. So yes, a lot to talk about, so I'll try and be as short as I can. It's very hard for me to be succinct about the Fatimids.
Do we have an extra couple of hours? Maybe not. No, someone said no. Okay.
So it's fascinating, as I said, when the Fatimids arrive from North Africa into Egypt, and as you rightly mentioned, Jauhar, his surname is very interesting, a Sicily, so therefore from Sicily.
Wow.
So there you go. And it's very interesting that when he arrives, Imam Muez had already, had detailed discussions and detailed plans on the foundation of where the city of Cairo was to be founded. And it is said that when he arrived, the very day that the Fatimid army finally crossed over into Giza, that very day Jauhar marched to the spot where that had been identified by Imam Muez in 969, and this the foundations of the city were laid with 2 buildings, the Azhar Mosque and the Imam's Palace. Right? These are the 2 buildings that are established. And when this happens, it is also very interesting talking about this idea of what did Egypt look like at the time? Yes. Well, as we know, Egypt is one of the earliest cradles of Muslim civilization, right? But not just Muslim, many previous human civilizations, right? So it is really a country that has a lot of diversity in terms of, so we, as I said, peoples. So we know that at this time when the Fatimids arrived, Egypt was only just becoming majority Muslim. but the indigenous population were Coptic Christian, but there were also Nestorian Christians, Melkite Christians, there were several denominations of Jews. So when the Fatimids come in Egypt, they find a very diverse populace. And they used those principles that they'd learned and cut their teeth on in North Africa as their given principles of governance here, of inclusive governance here in Egypt. And one of the fascinating things that they do is that they allow for each of the Sunni madhabs, Maliki, Hanafi, Shafi, each of these to continue to practice as per their madhab.
Right.
And they provide for their spaces of worship and congregation. So the state provides for their upkeep, etc., but the believers could continue practicing within their own religious tradition, within their own madhab, within their own branch. They also set up a system of justice where on matters of personal law, they could be judged according to their own madhab. And they offer the same privileges to the Jews and Christians as well. So it's a very fascinating period in overall Muslim history with the arrival of the Fatimids in Egypt. So one could look at it from various facets.
And in your slide, the title you've put there is the Fatimid Guarantee of Safety.
Yeah.
Again, something that as a theme is coming across from the first moment of 905 now into this 969 period, still offering protection
Very much
to
so.
all.
To all.
And that becomes a very powerful driver. And I can see that, of course, you've written the book, the founder of Cairo, and we could do a few hours on that one as well. Around the mosque and the center where the learning took place, what else can you share with us with that?
That's a really good point to bring up, and I forgot mentioning it earlier. But it's very interesting that the Azhar gets set up, of course, as a mosque initially, but within less than 10 years of its establishment, 35 scholars are housed next to the Azhar with the principal purpose that they teach on various subjects in between prayer times. So it becomes a communal hub, it becomes a center for learning, as much as it is also a place where the Shia, come together to offer their salat, etc. So it serves as both these functions from very early on in its establishment. It's also the place where, you remember the Majalis Al-Hikmah I talked about earlier?
The Majlis of Wisdom.
Yes. These also happen in the Azhar. So this idea of allowing for the mu'minun, the believers, the Ismailis, to continue to receive teachings and guidance of the Imam, to give their offerings, to receive tabarruk from the Imam. All this happen, tabarruk, what we call in our tradition, jura,
yes,
right? Barakah, receiving barakah from the Imam. All of this happens at this Majalis Al-Hikmah, which is only for those who have given allegiance to the Imam as the Imam of the time, okay? But it is also a space where Muslims can come to learn about all the known religious sciences and disciplines, etc. So it functions in this multivalent way, much like we hope the Ismaili centers and the aspiration of the Imam that these are centers of learning, they are centers of collaboration, they are centers of markers of identity, but also place of prayer for the believers, right?
Right, a multi-purpose.
Multi-purpose.
Yeah. And while we're in Egypt and under the period of Imam Moyes in Egypt, I think you have something to share with us with regards to another celebration of Eid.
The final
in
one
973, yeah.
The final one now, yes. So this is very interesting. It hasn't made it into this book because that's going to come.
Soon.
So a foretaste of what's to come.
We'll tease people. Yeah.
So it's interesting because days after Imam Moyes arrives, so Jauhar arrives, as we said, in 969. Imam Moyes then arrives in 973. Days after he arrives into Cairo, and it's interesting that it's when Imam Moyes steps into Cairo that Cairo comes to be called Cairo. Prior to that, it's called Al-Mansuriya as a connector to the city of Mansouriya in North Africa. And you have several features that are common between the two. Yeah, it's built on that.
So it changes literally on his arrival.
It's the day he walks in that it now comes to be called the victorious city of Imam Muiz, right?
Amazing.
So of course the city erupts in festivities, and then very soon after there is this Eid al-Fitr, and you have this very, very vibrant, very vivid description of how the Imam goes from the palace to the Azhar to lead the prayer. You know, his family and his retinue are with him. There are elephants and all these other, animals as part of the procession, along with, of course, horses, etc. But one of the fascinating things, again, I'd like to mention here is that during these ceremonial functions and celebrations, the Imam would bestow upon those who had served him gowns, robes, and these robes were often called tiras. They had inscriptions engraved on them with benedictions on the Imam, etc. So they were seen as now part of receiving the tabarruk of the Imam, the barakah from the Imam. And some of these gowns were designed, we are told in the sources, with these long flowy sleeves. And the idea was that when they got invited to the feast at the Imam's palace after the prayers had been completed, they were given these little sweetmeats that were specially made for the occasion, and they were given lots of these to take in their sleeve to then take back to their family,
to others who
to their friends who couldn't attend, as part of the tabarruk from the house of the Imam. So you have some very fascinating examples of this period in this way.
Beautiful. Now, I'm going to try and close because I can see some questions are coming through as well. But there's something really quite beautiful that I wanted to bring up. So I think the slide is up, and this is called the Gathering of Four Imams. And if I read out for those of us at home, and then maybe you can add something to this for us. Quote, one day, Al-Qaim bi Amrillah, upon him be peace, was in his father Al-Mahdi's majlis, or gathering, seated in front of him. His son, Ismail al-Mansur, was standing in front of his grandfather when Al-Mahdi said to him, bring me your son, that is Al-Muiz il-Din Allah. So his nursemaid brought him. He was 1 year old, or a little older. Al-Mahdi took him on his lap and kissed him. Then he said to his son, Al-Qaim bi Amrillah, O Abu al-Qasim, there is not a gathering more illustrious on earth than this one, as four imams are gathered here. Beautiful.
Isn't it? And this is something that Imam Muiz recollects much later, in his own lifetime. He says, I remember when, and there are lovely stories around this as well about this particular occasion that, again, where people are very welcome to read.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful, and I wasn't aware of this until we spoke. So wrapping up this bit so we can go to questions, when's your next segment going to come out for us to read?
So inshallah, I am working on it. We are hopeful that early in the next year we should be able to bring out Fatimids too, the view from Egypt, and then that will cover the 200 years of the Fatimids.
We'll complete that.
Inshallah, we'll complete that.
And you can see on the slide right now, for those of you watching at home, the other books. If you just wanted to talk about those.
Yes, so the series, as I said, one of the main purposes of the series is also to address these misperceptions around, Islam being a monolith, to give a much more deeper, more textured, more nuanced understanding of the diversity and plurality of the Muslim world. And so we are working on several titles along the way. We've got our second book, Beyond the Mosque, which has already been part of this Meet the Author series, and the third book on Prophet Muhammad, which we've also had as part of Meet the Author series. So it's very interesting. Where also you will notice these books are getting translated in all major Jamaati languages. So you will see on the screen, for example, the Fatimids is already available in Portuguese, in Russian, in Gujarati, in Farsi. We are working on Arabic, etc.
So there's Urdu. No excuse.
No, there isn't.
There's no excuse not to read them.
There shouldn't be. And these are available because the Jamaat the readership have been telling us this for years. They want audiobooks as well, so that they can listen to these books. Not everyone likes to read.
And who's the voice of your book?
It's a lady that we commissioned to do this for us. But we have an audiobook for, as soon as we publish the text, we publish the audio as well. So for all these 3 titles, the audio is available, and they are available in digital forms.
So you can download
it on Kindle.
And when we start commuting, we can get those back in.
Absolutely.
So, and I think that the next publication, a very exciting one.
It is talking about celebrations. So one of the guidances from Maulana Hazar Imam to us around this accessible series was that we should also have a series that directly targets Jamaati readership, that it is principally for the Jamaat.
Yes.
And it gives them a better understanding of our history, our heritage, our practices, our ceremonies. So our first book in that title, called Ismaili Festivals, Stories of Celebration, is by Dr. Shiraz Kabani, where he looks at various festivals, Muslim festivals, Shia festivals, Ismaili festivals, and he tells them in this very engaging way through also his own personal experiences and travels, etc. So that we are hoping to make available to the Jamaat in the next few weeks.
Wonderful.
It's on the cusp of
that's
production.
another great publication we're all looking forward to. Now, thank you to the questions team. They've come through. There's many here.
Okay.
Let's see how many we can get through.
Okay.
First question, Sardinia today, as we know, is very important to our present Imam. Was there any connection to Sardinia during the Fatimid Empire?
Not that I have come across directly. I think that broader region, yes, because Genoa, Pisa, what were called the Italian states, those were definitely even interactions with Venice.
Yes.
We have all of that being referenced. But I personally don't know specifically about Sardinia in that way. But certainly something for me to keep an eye out on.
Yes, exactly. Kind of a quick fire round, so we'll go through the next one.
Sure.
Question is, why Imam Mahdi chose to go to Africa and not to Sindh or Yemen? Was there a strategic decision, or Abu Abdullah Shi insisted Imam come to the north? So, because we talked about Yemen having the training and Sindh as well.
We did. Really good question. There's a whole article I'd written as part of my master's thesis around the initial destination of the Fatimid Caliphate, Yemen or Maghreb, i.e. North Africa.
Yes.
Because conditions in Yemen were all set up for the Imam to go there. When he arrives in Egypt, when he leaves Salamia, he has to live overnight because of the Abbasid agents hearing about the fact that the Imam has been now declared, etc. When he arrives in Egypt, he spends several months there. But conditions in Yemen take an untoward turn.
All right.
Because 2 dais usually used to be sent in pairs. The 2 dais who had been sent to Yemen, there is a split between them.
Right.
One of them continues to remain loyal to Imam Mahdi, who is Ibn Hawshab, and whose son then goes on to serve Imam Mahdi in North Africa. But the second one, Ali bin al-Fadl, was militarily more powerful, more successful, etc. And he doesn't accept the dhuhur, the pronouncement of the Imam as the Imam, and decides to continue with the Dora Satar and the return of Muhammad bin Ismail, which is one of the issues that had happened. Another division that had happened.
We could spend longer, yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
So while Yemen was a very viable option, in fact, North Africa became the real destination.
Yeah, I'm just looking at quite a few questions here. So
I'll let you group them if you
well,
like.
I'm trying to group them. There's an interesting one. What are the most important aspects of the Fatimid rule which are evident in the current Ismaili period? And that could take a few hours.
That could take.
And you might need a whiteboard. But there anything that comes through?
Yes, at least couple of thoughts, right? Just thoughts. When we look at how Maulana Hazar Imam today talks to us about the role of intellect and this idea of teaching, learning, the role of education, to my mind, what the Fatimids established as principles, right? This Majalis al-Hikmah where people were taught, etc. This Azhar, after that there were several others that they set up. They set up what came to be called the Dar al-Hikmah, which became a major center of learning and scholarship on all the known sciences of the day, subjects of the day. To my mind, this establishment of institutions of knowledge and learning, but also this importance to the role of intellect that you see in this period, alongside also the firm conviction of the continuity of imamat, of the imam being the, the wali, the guide, etc. So to my mind, these ideas and some of the values that you find at that time, that we also see are part of our imamat today. So it's not like for like, it's 1,000 years ago.
Yes, of course.
So we need to bear in mind.
But there are always lessons, I think.
But there are lessons,
yeah.
and there are what Hazram is called attitudes. Attitudes as precursors of attitudes for the 21st century. And if I recall right, he mentions three. He mentions the role of intellect. He talks about relations among Muslims being warm and cordial. And he talks about relations between Muslims and non-Muslims also being warm and cordial. And he says these are the attitudes that we can learn from that period that are really significant for the 21st century.
Yes. There's a really nice question that's come through, and I think it has a little bit of relevance for contemporary issues that we're facing right now. It says here, the early Fatimid period in an empire that was named after Hazrat Bibi Fatima, were there any steps taken to give rights to women? And I'm talking about inheritance, right to prayer and mosque, etc. Maybe just to broaden that question a little bit, what was the role of women? And do you have anything that you could talk to that and maybe we can learn from today even?
Yeah, a very interesting question again. So now when we talk about rights, of course, that is a much more modern language, right? In those all pre-modern societies, this idea of rights are understood very differently. It was understood much more as duties, etc. So that's just to kind of note that again, it's a very different period. But in terms of the role of women and the involvement of women, one of the things that I mentioned again is that the Dawah had women in it, and the Da'is used to hold sessions for women too. The involvement of women within the da'wah was very powerful right the way through. But you also have examples. So you have there are two women who come to mind immediately, Sitt al-Mulk, Imam Hakim's sister, and also there is a lady called As-Sayda al-Arwa who actually gets appointed as the chief da'i of Yemen in India. When I say India, I mean the whole Indian subcontinent,
yes,
by Imam Mustansir Billah. And she functions as the chief da'i. She's also the head of the Sulayhid state. The Sulayhids were a dynasty who established themselves in Yemen, and they give allegiance to the Fatimids. Sayda al-Arwa functions both as a head of state, Sulayhid state, but she also functions as this. And in terms of the rights of inheritance, Rahim, you'll enjoy this story because we know that in Shia law, women get a better inheritance share than they do in Sunni law. So this is always because, again, of Fatima and Fadak and all of that, right? So you find that in Fatimid times, because there were these various courts of law where people could go get judgment on personal law according to their own madhab, the Jewish women cotton on to the fact that even from what they could get in their own tradition, the Shia law would give them a better deal on inheritance.
And they could choose that for personal law.
They could choose. So they would come into Shia courts and seek judgment based on that. And so, of course, then the Jewish, legal scholars had to take that on and, sort of provide a corrective. So you find that for their time, there were several ways in which women could be were involved and participated.
This is kind of that last question for you. What period, what issue, what topic from the Fatimids requires now more research still, which also could benefit us in terms of not just historic significance, but lessons to be learned as an expert in the area?
So, what I think we need to do a lot more of, we think we know a lot about the Fatimids, and I think relative to some of the other periods of our history, we do, but there is so much more to learn, not just from texts. I mean, you saw right through the presentation, we had images, we showed the Blue Quran, for example, which was a unique kind of, use of that vellum and that ink and that, writing that is often ascribed to the Fatimid period of North Africa. They minted coins that were very distinctive, and again, we could have a whole conversation, the use of gold. So what I'm saying is there's a whole field of material culture that one could learn from, apart from just the text. And there are several other such mediums through which we could learn. Epigraphy, lots to learn from that. Right? So as somebody who has dabbled in the Fatimids, I feel it's like what Einstein had said, right? Pebbles by the ocean when there's a whole ocean there. But if we were talking about one particular period, I would say it's the period of the reign of Imam al-Hakim bi Amrillah. It is the one period where Abbasid historiography has really gone to town with in terms of how he is portrayed and portrayed in very negative ways. I don't think we've done enough homework ourselves on that. I think there's a lot more we need to research and learn and bring to bear in terms of arriving at perhaps a more balanced, at least a more informed understanding. So for any of you listeners and readers, if you're interested, this is a vast, vast field, and you could explore it in lots and lots of different ways. And believe you me, it's great fun as well. So I invite you to that.
So I think with that, Shainool, I'm going to thank you very much for being so honest and so open and so informative. And I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. And it's now becoming quite dark here in the evening in the Ismaili Centre in London. From us in London, thank you very much. And I hope, Shainool, you will sign my book.
You've done well. Not will I sign your book, but I thank you sincerely for, joining me in this conversation, and to everyone here at the Ismaili Centre for really making this happen.
Thank you to all the AV team and the ITREB teams who have put all this together. So over to the Zoom team.